Hi, folks. Thanks again for coming on Stampede Hot Day in July. I cannot thank you enough. OP, today is July 11th, 2022. Welcome to Chapters and Chat Book Club. Going strong for 6 years now. OP Naganago Mekoche Chestokomaki or Dekots Nagotine Siku. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the opposed US-Canadian border are the Blackfeet. North of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney Nations, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. As it is July, it's Stampede Month. I just think it's important to understand the straight agenda and gendered violence was and is forced on these lands by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as the guest, and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so-called time of reconciliation. It's important land acknowledgements have meaning. I encourage all to introduce themselves with their acknowledgement of their ancestors' stories of displacement, and how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, and other land displacement, so we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you don't know how to pronounce your local Indigenous nations' names, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression, or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around for my community, my family, and myself. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101. It immediately addresses colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and law is taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves native Calgarians or Torontonians show me that you don't have any Indigenous 101 understanding. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to the land of the Hare people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area of Pincho Tine Indahe and Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot Mokinstis, pointing to my elbow and tapping, as Michelle Elliott, an English name, which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I'm a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card, which is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous people's inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous LGBTQ2+ community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. And today, I am not going to put people on the spot and ask you if you had read chapter 3 and 4. Instead, what I will do is just kind of emphasize chapter 3 and 4 here, and I'll give a little summary to get things started. So chapter 3 is emphasizing accountability through human rights tools. So there's an introduction into why human rights and international human rights context, applying international human rights instruments to ensure accountability, domestic rights instruments in Canada, Indigenous rights and human rights, a complicated relationship, and a conclusion of understanding the need for more self-determining solutions. So I thought that would be a really good place for me to just kind of give an overview of chapter 3 on 221 for folks who may not want to admit that they did not read the whole thing. And the other thing is too, in our book club, we also allow Indigenous people to speak first. So we'll go around and ask everybody, and I just really encourage Indigenous people to tell their truth. So the conclusion of chapter 3, understanding the need for self-determining solutions. As these examples demonstrated, a one-dimensional approach to rights can serve to perpetuate violence. Indigenous women rights include both individual human rights and collective Indigenous rights, with overlap between these two categories, where collective rights are also human rights, and Indigenous rights also belong to the individual. As a result, solutions do not rest within only human or Indigenous rights instruments, and neither do they rest only in governments. Addressing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersect, and A stands for androgynous peoples require new solutions that conceived, driven, and managed by those affected. This is why it is important to stress the realization of these rights, both within Indigenous context and within framework of human rights, requiring self-determined solutions. As Brenda Gunn told the National Inquiry, it's really important that we realize that in order to fully realize all rights and self-determination, that they all need to work together and that they're on the same field with the same end goal. In short, she said, self-determination is really a starting point for the realization of human rights. Daly, Sambo, Duro agreed. Self-determination is required in order for Indigenous peoples, either collectively or individually, to benefit from the exercise of the rights of self-determination of Indigenous peoples. With the truth-gathering process, many people testified about the need to consider context and to promote self-determined solutions appropriate for each nation or community according to their own standards and needs. As Brenda Gunn testified, a national step-by-step process is not appropriate to apply to all. A good plan would account for the diversity among nations, creating frameworks and steps to ensure that implementation is appropriate to specific regions and issues. In addressing the challenges of the Indian Act, ban governance or self-government agreements among the other Indigenous people, which would be implored in the next chapter, some witnesses also suggested that human rights standards should be operational within communities and for Indigenous governments, urging those governments to take the initiative on adopting legislative reflective of these instruments. Brenda Gunn explained that we may have some moments where we reflect to make sure that our own legal traditions are upholding current standards of international human rights laws in a way that is appropriate for our traditions. Jean Leclerc, which I'm sure I mispronounced wrong with my lack of French, considers it essential that Indigenous governments undertake the adoption of human rights principles founded on their own Indigenous laws, particularly with UNDRIP. For those who may be new, UNDRIP stands for the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For many of them, federal and provincial laws suffer the lack of legitimacy, but since the declaration is a product of their own collaboration, they can certainly be inspired by it. They are governments after all. Through the respect of these instruments, including both collective and individual rights, Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people can work on holding all governments accountable for the measures that they are taking or not taking to address the crisis of violence. But as the testimonies before the National Inquiry assert, the state itself cannot guarantee the safety of all Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people. However, it can enact and enforce laws and put greater emphasis on catching predators, contribute to changing the perspective of those who see the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people as somehow of less value than of lives of non-Indigenous people, and define its own values and service standards to honor Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit people. Haley B. pointed out, I'm a lawyer, I'm educated, I speak to huge conferences of people about child protection, about GLADU, about prisoner rights, about Aboriginal offenders, about the structural racism and systemic racism that our people have suffered, and the laws and the policies and practices that have impacted our people over multiple generations. And I couldn't even get an RCMP to listen to me with any dignity and pride. And I understood even more profoundly the racism that my mother experienced throughout her life from the 50s now to today. So I could keep reading, but I think I'm going to stop there and go around. And obviously, I encourage Indigenous people to speak first. So if you had a chance to read chapter 1, I'd love to hear from you. And I'll open it up to anybody who might want to talk about it at all. And if not, I'll just start going alphabetically. All right, so Joanna has her mic off. Oh, Kathy has her mic off. Okay, Kathy.
Yes, I managed to read chapters 3 and chapter 4, and I have lots of things sticky taped, but I'm going to just go through it really quickly. I was really shocked at how little I knew about, not shocked, embarrassed more is the better word, for how little I knew about the history, and like I've never been really into politics and stuff. So chapter 3 was a real big learning curve. There was a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know. Some of it I knew from my recent readings, but I was just surprised, or not so surprised, how Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States were the 4 countries who voted against the UNDRIP, or the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Like I had heard that before, but reading it again was kind of sad. That was on page 195. And then again with the UNDRIP, on page 198, it talks about it problematically and foundationally still assumes the sovereignty of the nation state, does not address Indigenous political, cultural, and territorial claims on a government to government or culture to culture basis. So I mean, UNDRIP is good, but it's just not quite good enough. Like we need something a little, well, we need rights to run our own lives in Canada here. You know, it's our country, right? And then, oh yeah, and then you were talking about Brenda Gunn. There was a lot that I underlined about her. There's a lot there. I hate this one. I'm not quite ready, but okay. Now on page 203, in 1996, the act was amended. So they're talking about the Canadian Human Rights Act, was amended to include sexual orientation as a prohibited grounds of discrimination, and then amended to include greater gender identity or expression in 2017. Until 2013, the act also contained clauses prohibiting hate speech. And then at the very end of that chapter, it says this section was repealed in 2013. That just like blew me away. Like, why would they go backwards? It's kind of like it just seems like, why would they repeal hate speech? Like, so they left it up to the provinces, and then they cover that in the next couple of pages. Provinces have their own laws regarding hate speech and hate literature and all that stuff. So I found that interesting. And then on to, let's see. Just trying to pick some of the more interesting things. I'm really bad. I think everything's interesting and I highlight so much stuff. Okay, so more of my ignorance. I didn't know that. I thought the white paper got, oh, can't even see me. I thought that the white paper was called the white paper because it was written by white people. So I got a laugh out of that when I realized that that in the Canadian legislature, a policy paper is called a white paper. So, you know, I always, you know, in my lack of education and ignorance, thought it was white paper as because it was written by the white people. I thought it was just a nickname that we called it the white paper. And then our response was called the red paper, right? Like,
but really, Kathy, are you wrong? Because they really are only written by white people.
Yeah, but it's like, yeah, it's fitting, isn't it, that it's called a white paper, a policy paper. Okay, so on page 200 and I hate this. My glasses don't work so good for me. 219, I believe it's, yeah. Okay, when in 1969, he argued, we won't recognize Aboriginal rights. We can go on adding bricks of discrimination around the ghetto in which Indians live, and at the same time helping them preserve certain cultural traits and certain ancestral rights. Or we can say you are at a crossroads. The time is now to decide whether the Indians will be a race apart in Canada or whether they will be Canadians of full status. Indians should become Canadians as all other Canadians. This is the only basis on which I see our society can develop as equals. But Aboriginal rights, this really means saying, we were here before you. You came and cheated us by giving us some worthless things in return for vast expanses of land. And we want to reopen this question. We want you to preserve our Aboriginal rights and to restore them to us. And our answer is no. We can't recognize Aboriginal rights because no society can be built on historical might have beens. So that was Trudeau's response back in 1969. Like I just kind of made me sick to my stomach when I read that. Oh, and like the Assembly of First Nations, with what's going on there now. I didn't know that it was called the National Indian Brotherhood, that was its roots. So, you know, like how misogynistic is that organization? You know, like they're just showing their true colors right now with what they're doing to the president. And sorry, her name's not coming to me right now. I know she's from up north.
Roseanne Archibald.
Right, that's it. I'm getting tested for Alzheimer's tomorrow, so we'll see. Yeah, so yes, I'm embarrassed by how little I know sticker can go away. I've already said that. Oh, and I think I even mentioned that today when I on page 239, I don't know why it says for a very long time prior to the colonial and post-colonial periods, this little blip on the trajectory of our history. I don't know why that caught my attention so much, other than the fact that I just like the idea of post-colonial, like, yeah, it's just like, yay, I wish we could be post-colonial. So I found that, I don't know, I like that sentence in there. What are you doing? Oh, okay, so on page 251, when they start talking about banishment, like that is one of the worst things that First Nations people can do. Like if you could be the worst offender and that's what we would do, we would banish you because you need everybody. You need your community to live in our society or the way it was before. So banishment was like the worst thing that could happen to you. And just the way that the Indian Act, like Elder McGamagan pointed out the status provisions within the Indian Act and the rules around them that persist to this day were the equivalent of banishing women, a traditional form of capital punishment that opened them up to many other forms of abuse. Stop that. Yeah, that just, I don't know, it's just an example of how the Indian Act discriminates against women specifically. Oh yes, and on page 255, when it talks about a hindrance to the advancement of men, the hypersexualization of Indigenous women, that there again, it just really got me in the gut, like a punch to the stomach. Like, in addition, these stereotypes were often recorded in the House of Commons sessional papers, such as this one in 1909. The women here, as on nearly every reserve, are a hindrance to the advancement of men. No sooner do the men earn some money than the women want to go and visit their relations on some other reserve, or else give a feast or dance to their friends. The majority of the women are discontented, dirty, lazy, and slovenly. Like, wow, that was recorded in the House of Commons. Like, that's just disgusting. Like, and you know, this is the kind of stereotypes that have been brought about by the people that are running our country, that are supposed to be taking care of everybody in this country. It's just sickening, you know, like that's how they thought about us. And that's why there is the crisis with murdered and missing Indigenous women. Oh yeah, I think that quote's somewhere else too. Okay, I can't figure out, I didn't underline what I wanted to read on that page. Oh, right, on page 276 about the naturalization of some spaces as violent contributed to the devaluation of the lives of the people who inhabited these spaces. That is, there was and still is a presumption that people who live in these spaces should not be surprised when violence occurs in their neighborhood or when they are victims of violence. This kind of victim blaming ignores the complicated history of colonization that has consistently relegated Indigenous people to the margins of society. You know, like, it's just, you make people poor and desperate, and then you blame them for being victimized. It's just really sad, you know, like, oh yes, and on page 281, in Saskatchewan, the process, when they talk about the 60 scoop. So I never realized that there was actually a formalized program. In Saskatchewan, the process was formalized into programs such as the Adopt Indian Métis program from 1967 to 1969. As a initially funded by the government of Canada's Department of Health and Welfare, expressing strong opinions regarding the need for Indigenous people to assimilate. It included advertisements of First Nations and Métis children on television, radio, and newspapers across southern Saskatchewan that would induce families to investigate transracial adoption. I know I had seen on Facebook in places that they buy a kid for $10. I'd seen that where they had into the States, they had advertised children, buy your Indian child for $10, right? I'd seen that before, but I didn't know that Saskatchewan did it. I don't know why. I always thought Saskatchewan was more of a humanitarian province, because didn't they start social, like, welfare and stuff that came from Saskatchewan?
Yeah, for white people, never for Native people, never. No, it was serious. I'm dead serious. Like,
I know,
like they are so they to this day they are awful to our people. Like, they have never been progressive towards Natives.
Yes, so yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm still being raised by a German. I still have a lot of my white thinking still, you know, like I'm kind of lost in that sometimes, because I still think of Saskatchewan as a good place, sort of because of them starting welfare. But I do know, like, they let Stanley, whatever his name was, off. So, like, I know that, what am I saying? I couldn't even find a hotel to rent. They wouldn't rent to me. And people after me could go in and rent hotels in Saskatoon. So I know it's very racist in that province. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then when they start talking about the 60 scoop and child welfare today, I just like the one sentence on page 294 where it says, poverty has never been an acceptable reason for depriving children of their natural parents and their place in the extended family. Like, that just really, you know, really touched me when I read that, because it's so true. You know, like, just because people are poor, you should help them instead of like giving money to people white people to take care of the kids. Why not just help the family raise their own kids, you know? It'd be a lot better. Okay. Then on page 304, I found when they were talking about the Northern residential school experiences, an Inuk residential school survivor, Annie B., told the National Inquiry, my mother, she couldn't talk to me because I was English. We only had to communicate with our fingers. Communicating with my fingers with my birth mother. I found that really hard to swallow. Like, you know, like that's what was done to people, you know, like where you couldn't even talk to your own mother. You know, you had to try and make up your own sign language. Like, wow, that's just crazy. Sad and disgusting. Yeah, I think I'm gonna skip that one. So I think those are all the stickies that I have on my book, and I'm sorry that I'm so jumping around because I never do get around to trying to make any coherent message out of it all. I just end up with all these million stickies and then I have to just quickly look through them and go, what did I want to say about that? I don't remember. But thank you for letting me talk.
No, I'm grateful that you did. And, you know, since we kind of went into chapter 4, I'll just quickly read the conclusion that they call it a crisis centuries in the making, that this chapter examined a brief history of colonization in Canada through a gendered and intersectional lens, arguing that the policies, practices, and stereotyping confronting Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit today were put in place long ago. Understanding colonization as a structure of encounter rather than a series of isolated events, we have demonstrated how Indigenous knowledge systems and way of understanding land, governance, and identity were targeted by colonizers who wanted to possess the land and rid it of its people. In addition, we have focused our analysis on key encounters, policies and rules, stereotypes, and misconceptions that were applied differently to First Nation, Métis, Inuit, women, girls, and Two-Spirit, and have impacted them in harmful ways. At the same time, this chapter is a testament to the strength and resilience of these women, girls, and Two-Spirit people whose tradition and values continue to manifest at the individual, family, and community levels. There's more to say, obviously. I just thought we should probably quickly say that. And for our folks here, like I thought this was a really good chapter of talking about the Métis experience compared to the Inuit experience compared to the First Nation experience. So I really like that chapter for this. But because a lot of our Reconciliation Action Group is here, I wanted to just give this fabulous quote from John A. MacDonald, as so many people just love this man so much. You can find this on 254. And he had said, the depravity existing among the Indian women is greatly to be deplored. Excuse me, let me start over. They repair on arriving at years of puberty to the white centers and enter into lives of prostitution. What a prick, hey? Just to continue that stereotyping that actually Kathy had mentioned on the next page about things that were actually said in the House of Commons. And I have a really good book by Mark Abel that actually really takes so many historical quotes out of the archives of like John A. MacDonald, Langevin, all of those jerks, and just like awful quotes like this throughout it, right? So yeah, really, really great chapters. So yeah, I'll open it up. Joanne, you have your mic off. Would you like to start us off?
Yes, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm a settler on Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Nation, including Siksika, Bukana, and Kayan, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. I'd like to acknowledge all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries, and I express gratitude and respect for the land that we use, and pledge to end systemic racism, committing to advancing reconciliation with partnering with Indigenous people. So I read chapters 3 and 4. Thank you, Kathy, for your insight. Lovely to see, you know, your take on it. I mean, it was shocking anytime I read this kind of thing. I don't have all the pages like Kathy does, but they didn't like women of any shape, size, or color, and they brought it over to North America and probably New Zealand, Australia, the same nasty turn on how women should all be second class. So that's where they came from, is that tiered already, and then they brought it over and empowered the wrong people to introduce settlers to our First Nation people. I came, as much as I read it and the horrific abuse, I wondered how we can change that. How can we go to the youngest child and take that hate away from them? Because as many papers are written, people still have that hate for different people. And I'm at a loss.
So Joanna, I'm just going to stop you there because the whole purpose of this book club is actually to give you those solutions. So we have 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have all of the articles of UNDRIP. We have 231 calls to justice. And honestly, they lay out the framework of the answers.
Oh, good.
So when you know, like, I understand it's overwhelming at times, but that's because that's a history that's new to you. But this is my lived experience and many Indigenous people's lived experiences. And we have come to the table even prior in 1996 with solutions. So the solutions are there. Honestly, the onus is on the settlers, the non-Indigenous, to learn it, to advocate for it, to push their politicians and implement these. So, you know, I never want you to come to this book club and feel like, oh my gosh, I'm so overwhelmed, I don't know what to do, because that's the opposite. Here we work on those solutions as opposed to, you know, drowning in sadness, because that's what people who don't do action, that's what they do. They just sit there and cry and not do any action. And that's what the Reconciliation Action Group is for. So if you're interested in doing work, then absolutely, there's a million places. And even if the Reconciliation Action Group is not maybe your cup of tea, there are other reconciliation committees. And I say that not just to you, but to the entire, you know, people listening to the podcast and folks who, you know, genuinely want to move forward together. I truly believe that our Prime Minister and a lot of advocates are doing that work of moving us forward. And it's the Canadian population that needs to really start doing their own work. And I'll give you a simple example. There was an admin on a Facebook group today that denied an Indigenous mother the opportunity to share the missing child of her son. Now, he has been found and it's done. But the point is that we're pushing folks like yourself who are in positions of power and may not see a Facebook group as a position of power, but actually it is. And by denying that is a form of violence against Indigenous women, right? So the idea is to empower folks like yourself so that when you see that injustice, that you can speak to folks about that issue.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Carol, you're next on the list.
Hi, Michelle. So my pronouns are she and her, and I read it. And when I read it, I thought about how I felt, and then I thought, how do they feel? And I don't know if I can get through this without crying, but I'll try. And I'm not a weepy kind of person. But first of all, I have to say to Catherine, I like your idea of a red paper. And what would that look like? Wouldn't that be a great thing?
Oh, Carol, there was one.
I know. Well, I didn't know. I didn't know a red paper, so my ignorance. But I love that idea. Is it in here? Because I didn't see it in here.
No, it was the response to the white paper.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you were to look, that was the response, and actually in that chapter, they actually had other organizations that were Indigenous that gave replies to the white paper as well.
I did see that.
Yeah.
And I should say that I come from the ultimate colonizers. I come from the red-haired, lily-white skin, as I like to say, gray blue-eyed, Scottish, English colonizers. When I grew up, I was fortunate. I grew up with a mother who did not teach me hate. Full disclosure, I spent most of my swimming years at Mohawk Beach in the Tyendinaga Reserve. I had an Indigenous boyfriend and I had an Indigenous girlfriend. Never did we ever talk about residential schools. And I look back now and I think, why? Why didn't we know? Why didn't we talk about it? But in any event, I did read this and it made me sick. It made me sad, it made me sick, but I can see, I fully support what you say. It is up to people like me to correct the, how do I do it? The fact that when I hear the racism, do I recoil from these people or do I stay and fight? So what I do is I stay and fight. And I'm not popular, but that's okay because it's up to people like us. You have made the recommendations, they're there. And I had that exact conversation with somebody a week ago. So I see that things have not changed for women since that Malleus Maleficarum, but it especially did not change for Indigenous women. I was sickened by the 60s scoop, the way the RCMP treated women. It led me to a greater understanding and a deeper level of sickening. So the other thing I would say is I really like the way it's phrased as a structure. There are so many people, Michelle, who cannot grasp that. They cannot grasp colonization as a structure, misogyny as a structure. And I thought that was really valuable. I've got all my little pink spots, but I'm not going to go through them. So just thank you for letting me be part of this. Oh, and one more thing. It's the lack of the political will between the human rights instruments and normative law and how to make that shift. How to make that shift. Anyway, I've said enough.
But I'm glad you did. And I'm glad you brought up that piece too, because like, I don't know if everybody here is aware, but they appointed a new human rights commissioner to be in charge of that portfolio. And that man has said some awful things about Muslims already. So how we have yet another person who doesn't understand discrimination in a position of power is because our neighbors are voting UCP, right? And they're voting in racism, basically. So I think we as a population have to really start challenging people about their political belief system, because if you're purposely voting in racist, then at what point in time do we see change, right? And there has to be that working together. There has to be working together at all orders of government, as well as society in general. So we have a lot of work to do here in Alberta. So I'm glad you brought it up, frankly. Carrie G, you're next on the list, and then Kat.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm Carrie Gaze, and to be quite honest with you, I got the dates mixed up. So I bought the Audible to oh gosh, The Indian in the Cabinet. No, The Indian in the Cabinet. I'm a week bit. I'm on the 13th in my mind. So I quickly followed along. I've found it online, the National Inquiry. I've got it on my desktop, but it's just quicker to type it in. So yes, I have on my own time before the book club. I'd only gotten to chapter 2. So tonight, I have read quite a bit on other platforms regarding, sorry about the background noise, my son is watching TV. So I don't want to take up too much time because I haven't really read it directly. I'm not there yet out of the calls to action here. But my initial first thoughts are the same as others. And oh, yes, I'm a settler, a third generation settler in Trochu, Alberta. And I believe that's Treaty 7 still, Blackfoot, Dene, Tsuut'ina, and one I can't pronounce, so I don't want to butcher it. Yes, the atrocities are overwhelming to myself, because I can't believe that good people would not see the obvious. They wouldn't say any of this stuff, or wouldn't say any of these horrible, horrific, damaging things to Jewish people, of the sort. And I must disclose, my brother is a Calgary police officer, and so we have had many conversations, and they were very loud, and let's just say we're kind of still talking. So and that's not been easy, because this is, for me, it's really black and white. It's really black and white. We're all racist. I'm talking about myself and the Mayo sapiens that I belong to, and we're raised in a system that benefits us, and to deny that and to deny all that is just showing our whiteness, in my opinion. And yeah, I mean, the least I can do is get in my lane, know what that is, and do some work. And I'm starting with myself, starting with the reading, and starting with decolonizing my own ego and my own privileges, and seeing what that is. So in the future, if I'm allowed back, I'd appreciate it if you see anything that I need to be checked on, please don't hold back. So
I hope
thank you
you all know I wouldn't kick any of you out of the book club. The opposite. I hope that coming to it helps enrich everybody's understanding. That's the purpose of it, really. And I mean, at the end of the day, I need to force myself to read things, and that's why I have the book club. And I'm just grateful I have folks willing to come along with me, especially when it's hot, and especially during stampedes. So won't emphasize that enough to all of you for coming today. Thank you, Carrie.
Yes, thank you so much, Michelle. And yeah, glad to be here.
Just to tell you, funny enough, I'm part of the Indigenous Justice Circle for the Calgary Police, and more recently under Mark Neufeld, they've been really encouraging a lot more Indigenous content and resources. And I'm actually going to be sleeping in their teepee here, I think starting tomorrow night, because it's Blackfoot protocol that if you put up a teepee, somebody better be sleeping in it, because if there isn't, it's considered abandoned. And the RCMP have gotten their teepee stolen a couple of times in Blackfoot territory because they don't have someone sleeping in it.
Because they know it's not safe.
Yep, that's right. So they're going to put me in the Calgary Police one, and I'm going to be looking over at the RCMP teepee, and I'm going to be on social media letting everybody know the status of who's sleeping in the teepee and who isn't.
Quick, nobody's sleeping in it. Come get it. That I paid money to see that.
I know, and they're not happy about it, because like the Cree, because we're in Blackfoot territory, and outside of Blackfoot territory, you have a lot more, Cree and Métis of, hey, let's get along, and that's great, except that if you're not respecting their protocols here, like it's an important lesson about treaty between nations too, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's the funniest story. And I just applaud the Blackfoot for trying to teach that over and over.
You'd think they learn. It's pretty simple.
You think?
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
Right
That's
on.
great. That's great.
Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah.
So Kat, you're next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kat. I go by she, her, or they, them pronouns. I am a settler of British and German descent, so uber colonizers all around. My paternal side comes from Saskatchewan, so I hear you about Saskatchewan, let me tell you. And yeah, having those hard conversations with family it's a lifelong process, as well as decolonizing. I mean, I've been working on it a while and I'm still working on it. And, you know, you mess up all the time, but you just got to keep going and hope people forgive you. And, you know, Michelle's been super patient with us. And I really appreciate that. I read both chapters. I think even after reading the fourth chapter, it was like, why are not all Canadians reading this? Basic, simple, straightforward language telling you what's what happened, and what to do about it. That's all I got to say. I mean, Michelle read it on in chapter 3. It can enact government can enact and enforce laws and put greater emphasis on catching perpetrators, contribute to changing the perspective of those who would see the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S people as somehow less value than the lives of non-Indigenous people, and refine its own values and service standards to honor Indigenous women, girls, and 2S. That seems pretty easy to me, and we got to get on it. And as Michelle said, we have to take responsibility and push our elected officials and our community and our friends and our family, and just keep doing the work. Oh yes. And I also run a book club, the Settlers Book Club. So if you haven't gotten enough reading, you can also join my book club. Just go online, settlersbookclub.com, and that will tell you we're every 4th Monday, 2 weeks after this one. So, you know, you have 2 weeks to read a book in between. So yeah.
I know, but we're with our people here. These are people that like to read, right? So
yes.
it's a great book club. And I also wanted to say, you started off by saying, thank you, Michelle, for being patient with me. Well, it does go both ways, and I appreciate your patience with me when I do get impatient. So, you know, it goes both ways. So, and Kat runs the Settler Book Club, but she also does a lot of the Reconciliation Action Group admin stuff. So if you are interested, contact Kat. Obviously education first and then action. But I really feel like we have a good core group of doing both of those things. So I'm really honored to walk this journey with you all. So I hope you know that. So next on the list, Ewan, you're next.
Hello. Hi, thanks for having me today. I'm really happy to be here. Michelle and I have worked together on a couple of things before, and it's really nice to put some faces and names after hearing all of your recent book clubs on. The recent episodes have been awesome, and thanks for all of your commentary around that. I think I've gotten a huge amount out of it. So yeah, my name's Ewan. I go by he, him pronouns. Definitely a settler here, undisplaced, have a long history of, you know, my dad's a Scottish potato farmer, among various other things, and my parents both just kind of descend from Scottish ancestry, but never been displaced in any way, and I've really been privileged to have been welcomed in all corners of what many of us call Canada through my whole life, and I really do take that honor seriously. I see my role as a treaty person here in Treaty 7 to try and connect the dots between the past and present. Hopefully so that I can try and create a better future for all people on these lands. Acknowledge the presence and the ongoing presence and right to land of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and that's the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, and the Blackfeet south of the border, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina Dene, as well as the people of the Métis Region 3. I think really what I got out of this, I think I'll break into two quick sections. Chapter 3 is going to be really quick. I think you all have touched down on the main points of it, and I think John A. McDonald's points and the actually that's more chapter 4, but the white paper, Trudeau's white paper, was really the cornerstone of that chapter for me. Really just knocked home so many of the awful thinking that we're all rooted in, and that so much of our modern thinking is rooted in. But for me, human rights is at the root of chapter 3 as well. And for somebody that focuses as much as I do on drug policy and drug prohibition, and the drug poisoning crisis, I look at Jordan's principle as another cornerstone of that chapter, and just the fact that First Nations, Indigenous people across Canada, what we call Canada, just don't have access. To this day do not have access to the services that they should have. Going back to Kathy's point from earlier, we make people poor and desperate and then blame them for being victimized. That was her quote, and I think that we're now stripping away all these services like supervised consumption sites and putting barriers in front of them. It's just not in keeping with Jordan's principle, which it was legislated for children, but should apply to all people. There's no reason it shouldn't. So looking more to chapter 4, I think for me, the big headline was invasion is a structure, not an event. And so with my points within this, I'll focus really on the structures. And so within the structures, I would say, again, coming back to Kathy's points, the capital punishment of casting people out of society, to me, has a lot of parallels today with the drug poisoning crisis, incarceration as well. We say that we stand against capital punishment, but we send people to jail knowing full well that when they get out of jail, they're the most susceptible to drug poisoning that they'll be at any point in their life if they happen to use substances. The policing section from page 258 to 263 was very telling, especially given the history that we tell ourselves about the Mounties, about the Northwest Mounted Police. I think that's an incredibly important history, and it tells us a lot about how some of these structures were really put in place at the ground level. Moral panics around sex work, around human trafficking. These have huge parallels today, just exactly how they were back then, but also keeping with drug prohibition. And all of these things really tie together with regulation of movement. Incarceration, of course, makes another cameo in that. And then I think I just want to finish off by talking about the addiction treatment industry and the parallels that it has with residential schools. I think it also has parallels with child services. These are things that really were put in place to both Christianize and break up families. And I think that holds today as much as ever. The addiction treatment industry is not evidence-based. We just throw a lot of resources at it in the same way that we threw a lot of resources at residential schools in an attempt to enforce the will of the state. And I think that so much of that holds when we look at the way that we just don't measure success. We don't care about whether it's successful or not. We just let it do its thing. So thanks so much. I'll stop there. I hope I didn't take up too much time, and thanks for letting me speak.
No, I'm grateful that you're here and you are speaking, because I think our group, the Reconciliation Action Group, like we kind of need like that health subcommittee. And I know you've been basically doing that work. Unfortunately, a lot of our group don't have the digital literacy, so they don't see the great things you're retweeting. And then of course I am. And then of course I forget to go on to the Reconciliation Twitter and retweet all of your stuff as well. And I think it's really important because, you know, and you've heard me talk about that imposed Christian abstinence-based programming that is completely cultural, like it's just going to set us up to fail, which it does, which is exactly why the current government and the previous governments continue to do it, because ultimately the goal is what John A. McDonald's talking about here, where we still want to eradicate the Indigenous people so we can feel good about taking the land. And, you know, the current drug crisis right now is such a great mechanism for folks like that who have those evil belief systems. So anyway, I really support the work you're doing. I know we are disproportionately represented in the poisoning numbers, and that's why I'm grateful you're doing this work.
Thanks, Michelle. It's always so good to work with you on this stuff too.
Awesome.
And we did have an open letter that Michelle signed on behalf of Native Calgary, and it's got 50 points, 50 questions to the provincial government. How are you measuring success on the addiction treatment industry? I think this is important. I think it holds across Canada, but particularly here in Alberta.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, thank you. Rosemary, you're next on the line. She's so great. Here we go.
Hi,
Hey.
sorry about that. I
Don't
hit the wrong button.
We all do.
My name is Rosemary. I'm a white settler of Irish, English, French, and German descent. Ancestors, some came as early as the 1600s to New England, where some of them, thanked God for the smallpox epidemic that helped clear the land so they could settle there. And a lot of the ancestors were Irish, leaving Ireland due to poverty, etc. And they settled along in places like Syracuse, Little Falls, Albany, Troy, all industrial centers that started to boom after the railroads and canals were built. But to build those railroads and canals, a lot of land was taken away from the Mohawk and other indigenous nations along that area. And I was born and raised on the traditional lands of the Onondaga Nation in upstate New York. And I've lived here in Mohkinstsis for over 45 years now and raised 3 children. And I now have 7 grandchildren. And I fully recognize the privilege of being here and being able to live on this land, and also the privilege of the learning that we're all being afforded by Indigenous peoples about culture and spirituality, relationship to the land, etc. It's so important for all of us to understand. I read chapter 3 and part of chapter 4, and I'm probably going to jump around a little bit. But I think what was so critical is, again, we talk about truth and reconciliation. And on July 1st, Lee Crowchild, former chief from Sutina, said he doesn't even want to hear the word reconciliation because he feels that no one has really grappled with the truth. And I think it was in chapter 4, they're saying the truth is the genocide that's happened here. And that genocide, the purpose behind it was you get rid of and replace an existing society in order to impose and create another. In other words, the white colonial settler society. And for me, the other key theme was how crucial to that whole project. It's not just that, we brought attitudes from Europe about women that were detrimental to Indigenous women, but Indigenous women were so deliberately targeted. And I think in the introduction and preface to the whole report, and even here again, reiterating that point, that women are the givers of life, women are the teachers of tradition and value. So you harm women, and you're going right at the heart of a society. You take children away from women so they can't teach them. You kill women so they can't pass things on. You stigmatize women, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, that chapter just really solidified that. And I can't remember who else said it, but I agree. I find this whole final report critical. I think everyone should read it. I wasn't able to read the actual reports that came out with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but just based on some of the calls to justice around, for example, child welfare, they go much deeper, they're much richer. They take in a whole other level of experience. And I think it's noticeable that the calls for justice call upon all governments, including Indigenous governments, to take on these issues. And of course, in doing that, there's a recognition that because of colonization, all of those patriarchal attitudes that were brought from Europe, women-hating attitudes, our society is permeated with all of that. But I think also, though, and I think we heard this at the rally after the March for Justice for Colton Crochew, where you had, again, that recognition that we have to go back, where among Indigenous peoples, honor women again, have them be in their rightful place, in society, and have the influence they always had traditionally. And that's something, again, there's so much mythology around, oh, well, Indigenous women weren't treated well. Excuse me, many of the societies were matriarchal in nature. Roles may not have been the same, but they were complementary. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And related to all of that, in all of the stuff on human rights, that whole issue of individual rights and collective rights. And that's really something to wrap our heads around in terms of how that gets balanced, collective Indigenous rights and the individual rights of women as women. When they talked about the James Bay Agreement, I was just talking to someone else about that agreement from the perspective of income security, around the basic income discussion, and that the James Bay Agreement has been seen as a kind of income security program. But the latest critique that's come out about that is that, basically what that program said was that if men continued to hunt and trap to some extent, and they could prove that, they would then receive monies that were transferred from the federal government, to the James Bay Cree. They could receive that money. But nobody thought about women and their traditional role in the economy as the processors, right? So you hunt, you trap, who's tanning the hides, who's making things, who's selling them on the market. And that relates to something else. I was so angry in that whole discussion around, again, the stigmatization of Indigenous women, the stereotypes, and that stupid critique of, they're a hindrance to the advancement of men, because if men go out and they earn some money, then the women take it and they go visit relatives and they hold a feast. Well, that's because people don't understand that within many, I'm not going to say all, but many Indigenous communities, I know this for a fact, for Cree in Northern Alberta, women are the ones who build the reciprocal social relationships within a community, right? And that's what feasting is about. That's what visiting relatives is about. And I'll shut up soon. I just have one more point to make.
Okay, before you do, I want to add to what you just said, though, because
Sure.
Indigenous women were in governance, they were in leadership, and they continued to uphold treaties. So those treaties were literally the same type of thing that you would see men today doing when going to the UN, going to the G8, doing that international diplomacy, only they didn't see our nations as countries. So I just wanted to add to your point, because you're exactly right.
Thank you. That's important to remember. Just one last thing, in the section on treaties, they were talking about modern treaties. And on June 21st, I listened to a webinar and I sent the recording out to everyone in the group. And it's about a modern treaty from 2014 among Indigenous nations, north and south of the border. And it's called the Buffalo Treaty. And it's all about bringing the buffalo back, because Leroy Little Bear was one of the speakers. He said, in our culture, we have ceremonies about the buffalo. We have songs about the buffalo. We have stories about the buffalo, but where is the buffalo? And so there's this whole project that I didn't know anything about it. I would assume most settlers know absolutely nothing about it. This amazing treaty, right, that's been developed in this whole project and process. And the point made here about the killing of the buffalo echoes something that was said in that webinar, that the bison roamed the plains and, you know, Indigenous peoples hunted the buffalo. So they had that freedom of movement. And this is the first time I've read something where they said the killing of the buffalo was not just hunting to hunt, but the hope that you get rid of the buffalo, you destroy the economy, and then you can control Indigenous people and keep them. Yeah. So, and there was something else there, I can't remember if anyone else does. They made a parallel to the British in Ireland and the Canadian government here and Indigenous peoples on the prairie, but I've forgotten it. But I'll stop now. I just find this report, everybody should read it.
Agreed. We all should read it. And like, I can honestly say I never read RCAP. I just find little bits of it that I want to read. I wish I could read it. So we're obviously in a position we can now. So I'm just grateful that you're all doing it. And actually, I do know that email that you sent earlier, I actually forwarded it to some friends of mine because by chance, that's exactly what we were talking about at our meetings, was the Buffalo Treaty. And because people were so open to understanding it and hearing it, I was really happy to send them that, exactly what you sent me. And, you know, I'm a believer that, you know, our ancestors, creator, they talk through us. And I just don't think it was by chance in any capacity that, you know, you brought this up on at the same time. Like, it's just too serendipitous for me. Too much coincidence. Oh, good. Carrie put that. This is the YouTube link that Rosemary sent out that's public. And I'd love to talk more about that to folks, but you know, we only have so much time, and today we're talking about this, but maybe that's something we should consider talking about in a next book club, or maybe the Settlers Book Club, because I think it's a really important subject for us to be talking about. So thank you, Rosemary, for bringing all of that up. I appreciate that. Joanne spoke, Kathy spoke. Morgan, would you like to give us some feedback about your thoughts on all of this?
For sure. All right, so first time in Michelle's book club. I'm really glad to be here. I thought I had lots of time, but I ended up having like 5 things try to happen today, and I've been in Zoom calls all afternoon. Then I hiked like 11 kilometers this morning, but so I did read half. I read chapter 3. I wanted to get through chapter 4, but I also had other Zooms to prepare for today. So yeah, I'm very new to giving land acknowledgements, but I'm going to do my best. So feel free to give me some feedback. So I'm Morgan, he, him pronouns. I am in Calgary, Alberta, also known as Mohkinstsis, the traditional Blackfoot name for the Elbow River. I reside on Treaty 7, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy, made up of the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani First Nations. Also on Treaty 7 is the Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, my God, and Métis Nation. So I am a settler, grew up in Alberta with a lot of challenges and displacements, I guess you could say. I grew up in a incredibly abusive home. I was homeless, dropped out of high school, dropped out of university, earned most of my quad major while experiencing homelessness, was in a domestic violence relationship. And, you know, a lot of the healing process, I think, of these things was reaching for justice and reaching for social justice, dignity, and just not just healing myself, but also everything around me. And I think that that really is how I connected to social issues that were outside of the regular white settler experience. Because for so many white people, I think they just never would know about any of these topics, especially residential schools, but also missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So yeah, I think that's a good kind of just off the top of my head. Also worked on a lot of projects over the years, doing Indigenous events, attending. I've been going to the kind of Against Canada Day for an Indigenous Peoples Day event here in Calgary for a few years. God, I'm trying to think what else. I think when I first heard about residential schools personally was in university. I took a human rights course. I was trying to kind of prepare for law school. And I took a human rights course, and we had a component focused on Indigenous issues where Indigenous peoples were let down by the legal system. And I remember the professor started bringing Kleenex to the classes, because like all the other like pre-law students and some of the more law students were like fine, but I was like always breaking down and in tears because it was just a lot. So yeah, in terms of the chapter 3 that I did read and just hearing some of the pieces of chapter 4 as well, I think the first thoughts that I had were, you know, human rights as a tool and using superseding legal tools, like I think it is not just treaties, but covenants and other tools from the United Nations to interweave, you know, different mechanisms to keep the state accountable to the rights and dignities of the people, as well as the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. So the first thoughts that came to mind was these are very vertical dignities. You know, in political science, we have a political spectrum, and where we land on the spectrum is usually what we end up voting for. But a lot of people don't realize that social issues is one dimension, and then, you know, economic is another. So in terms of, I'm gonna make sure I don't get them mixed up. Horizontal liberation and horizontal dignities, I still think we have a long way to go in terms of not just, you know, giving people some dignity, but also making sure that the preconditions to being able to use that dignity. For example, if you have no money, if you have no access to the economy, if you have no access to livelihood or health or these sorts of, I don't know, just things that are all, you know, that make having human rights worthwhile. I don't think we're there yet. So that was one thing that I noted when I read the chapter. I was also thinking about imperialism and the British Empire. I know today I talk a lot in peace work about the American imperialism, but during the time of colonization, there was an impulse from the monopoly capital interests of the British Empire and other European, powerful people wanting to profit and plunder and meddle and dominate the new land in order to enrich themselves further. And yeah, it's just they did so at whatever cost. Like just no bar to the cost of the people who already lived on this land. So that was another thing that really struck me while I was thinking about this, was just like so much of that still happens, especially putting Indigenous peoples on reserves and putting them into positions of zero economic activity. And then basically, I think others mentioned some examples of women not being able to, not just culturally perform, an effect and this service for the culture, but also just like, this lack of opportunity and dignity also, opened market relations up for the sex trade. And we see this as a huge area of exploitation for women, girls, and LGBTQ people, two-spirit people, where the ripple effects over generations continue, from simply excluding women from a huge facet of society and culture, especially economically. And when people's bodies are sought after, especially, I think that the worst exploitation of the sex trade is on bodies that are more vulnerable. I think that then we see where there's a cycle where people want, to make money, but also, and they just want to participate in something. Like if you can't participate in the economy with no money, then what can one do to make money? And if these are the demands and the supplies of, well, I have a body, this is like generations of women having no other choice. So this is not some bad, wrong choice of women generations ago that started this. This was structural. And I think that was a huge thing that stood out to me, was just this element of, that we just, I think part of it was also just taking the blame off of the individual level, that, culture alone and love and tolerance isn't always enough. It's also structural. We have to give people dignity, and we have to ensure that there's accountability. And like I said, I still see not enough on the other side of dignity, which is also economic and lifting people out of situations where their dignity just has no effect, right? Because if you have no money, it has no effect. Yeah, I think that was that was my big points. It's just like imperialism, the sex trade, dignity, and how those all interconnect and into what we see, the violence that that came before these reports were released. And I think that in terms of human rights and all of the other rights, like the collective rights to self-determination as well as sovereignty, the treaty, people needing to make sure that the treaties are respected. These are basically, it's good that the language exists, but it's still happening. And in terms of, the plunder of unceded territories, treaty land, there are still big oil companies that are basically in the government's ears, especially in British Columbia, where they're just bulldozing Indigenous peoples and having state violence occur on behalf of the corporate interest. And yeah, I think that if we had those collective mechanisms to say, you know, that this is simply not the corporation's land, it's the people's land, you know, these things would not be happening. So yeah, that was my thoughts. Just we've got a lot of work to do, and I'm open to thoughts.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, chapter 2 even discusses that economic barriers, as well as you know, sovereignty, and what Sutuin Yinte having the you know, Delamuk in full of force. Yeah, look at the results because of all of this. Anyway, I really appreciate you weighing in too. I'm just gonna.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a white settler here on Treaty 7. On my father's side, so both my parents came to Canada in some way, shape, or form from the United States at different points in time. And my father's side was early 1900s to Northern Alberta. And then on my mother's side was closer to 16 or 1700s and Empire loyalists. So lots and lots of settlers and lots of Eurocentric thinking in my family. Really appreciate all that's been discussed and shared here. I just have one main point of emphasis I wanted to add to the discussion today, because I think most of the other things have been said, but I think what I really took away from chapters 3 and 4 was the description of a structure. So we often talk about colonialism, we talk about how do we deal with our racist practices, but I think what these chapters do is really articulate and characterize what that structure is. The note, one of the only quotes that I kept coming back to in my own notes was actually at the very end on page 312. It talks about colonialization as a structure of encounter, and just kind of describes all the different ways that we come up against this structure. And I think many others have pointed this out in our discussion, and I think you highlighted the point on invasion as a structure. Like I do think that a lot of what can be gained from these chapters, certainly what I gained was really just the piecing of all of it together, but thinking about what did that really look like, and realizing that it wasn't like one massive event, it was like a series of very deliberate events that were just imposed, and then we all are products of that, and especially white settlers, it was deliberate for us to not see these pieces. So just really want to emphasize what's already been emphasized a few times, which is everyone really should read these 2 chapters. I found I took a lot away, but also it can translate into a lot of other conversations. I think it illuminated for me things that I've read about before and thought about before, but I think, you know, especially when they were talking about the 60s scoop, I've asked my own family a lot of questions, and I know that they had positions of power and they had positions of leadership, and they wrote lots of things down. But when I asked family members who were children or teenagers during the 60s scoop, you know, how was this discussed in your family? It never came up, ever. Like Indigenous people were not discussed, and were not a part of their understanding of the world. And so I really think chapters 3 and 4 can help people to see that, because it certainly helped bring home to me how the structure got built, and therefore what we need to do to unravel that. So thanks very much for the discussion today.
Oh, it was such a great add that you said here, Wendy. And just kind of add to your point, I was at the airport waiting to board, and there was a delay. So there was a gentleman beside me, and he was an older white male, and he had his phone, and he was watching a TV show. And as soon as the TV show started talking about Two-Spirit, he fast forwarded it. So just to say, in 2022, there are a lot of people that just don't want to have that a discussion about Indigenous people no matter what. Now, maybe he's just homophobic. I don't know, but it was really clear from the small part that was listened to, it was a cultural teaching about our Indigenous ways of knowing, and he wasn't interested in talking about that and fast forwarded through it. And maybe I should be nicer about it. Maybe I shouldn't be so judgy about it. But that was just a bad day for him, and that's why. But ultimately, I just think it adds to what you're saying. It's 1960 or 2022. There are either people invested in talking about this issue or people who aren't. And I would actually argue everyone here is somehow invested in human rights, and that's why we're all having these discussions, right? And I had always felt when I joined political parties that this should be a slam dunk. I mean, this is a human rights issue, and these parties supposedly stand for human rights. And I'm only seeing a little bit of change since 2015. Now, I would say I've been seeing huge amounts of change. Is it enough as an Indigenous person? No, but it's so much more than what I'd seen prior to 2015. And Kathy even brought up when Harper had changed the hate speech laws, and I told people what the importance of that. And now we've seen a huge escalation in hate being said online and on person to person. And then COVID happened, and anti-Asian hate is on the rise. It's just everywhere. And I hate that he repealed that, but he did it on purpose. And this is why I'll never understand why anyone supports the Conservatives, because they are so anti-human rights. And that feels anti-Canadian. But at the end of the day, all parties of all stripes did not see Indigenous people as humans until more recently, and arguably some still don't, right? So I appreciate what you have to say there. And I open it up to anybody. We're past our 8 o'clock, so I say thank you to anybody who stayed this long, because it's a hot stampede night. And Kat, I appreciate you. She says, Michelle and everyone, great discussion. Sorry, I have to go. I have to finish packing. Take care, and I'll see you.